Section 21 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tanya K. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Two Highland Dogs by Ms. Goodrich Freer. Part 1. Ree and Spirag were two Highland dogs who lived in a beautiful valley not far from the west coast of Scotland, where high hills slope down to the shores of a blue loch, and the people talk a strange language quite different from English or even from French or German or Latin, which is called Gaelic. The name Ree means a king, and Spirag means a sparrowhawk, but they are words no one except the Highlander can pronounce properly. However, the dogs had a great many friends who could not talk Gaelic, and when English-speaking people called them Ree and Spiraw, they would always answer. Ree was a great tawny deerhound, tall and slender, very stately as a king should be, and as gentle as he was strong. He had a rough coat and soft brown eyes, set rather near together, and very bright and watchful. His chief business in life was to watch the faces of his friends and to obey their wishes quickly, to take his long limbs away from the drawing-room hearthrug when the butler came in to put on the coals, not to get in the way more than so big a dog could help, and not to get too much excited when anything in a conversation suggested the likelihood of a walk. But his father and all his ancestors had led very different lives. They had been trained to go out on the mountains with men who hunted the wild deer and to help them in the chase, for the deerhounds run with long bounds and are as fleet as the stag himself. Then, when the beautiful creature had been killed, it was their duty to guard the body and to see that carrion crows and eagles and other wild birds should not molest it. But Ree's master was a bishop who, though he lived quite near to a great deer forest and often took his dogs over the hills to where the deer lived, never killed anything, but loved to see all his fellow creatures happy among the things they liked best. Spirag was a very little dog, of the kind that is called a Skye Terrier, though the island of Skye is one of the few places in which a long-haired terrier is very rare. He was quite small, what his Highland friends called a wee bit doggy. He was very full of life and courage, wonderfully plucky for his size, like the fierce little bird whose name he bore. Like a good many little people, he lacked the dignity and repose of his big companion, and though very good-tempered among his friends, was quite ready to bite if beaten, and did not take a scolding with half the gentleness and humility with which Ree would submit to punishment, perhaps because he needed it oftener, for he was so busy and active that he sometimes got into scrapes. He was only 3 years old at the time of this story, and Ree was 7, so it was perhaps natural that Ree should be the wiser of the two. They lived in a beautiful house quite near the loch, and they had a large garden to play in, and they could go in and out of the house and do just as they liked, so long as they came when they were cold, and did as they were bid, and did not climb on the sofa cushions when their feet were muddy. There were very few houses on their side the water, and as their friends went about in boats as often as other people go out in carriages, the dogs were used to the water and could swim as easily as walk, and what is more, knew how to sit still in the boat, so that they were allowed to go anywhere with their friends because they gave no trouble. They had a very happy life, for there was always something going on, which is what dogs like, and plenty of people to go walks with. Their young masters sometimes went out with guns, and the dog, a country dog, loves a gun better than anything in the world, because he knows it means business in which he can help. Sometimes their mistress took them for a walk, and then they knew that they must be on their best behavior and not wander too far from the road and have to be whistled back, and not fight with the collies at the cottage doors, nor chase cats, nor be tiresome in any way. They generally kept close beside her, Ree walking very slowly so as to accommodate his big strides to the progress of a poor human thing with only 2 legs, and Sperag trotting along with tiny little footsteps that seemed to make a great fuss and to be in a great hurry about nothing at all. There was nothing, however, so delightful as going for walks with their own master, the bishop. For one thing, they generally knew he really meant to do something worthwhile. Pottering about with a gun or escorting a lady is pleasant enough, but it generally means coming home to lunch or tea, and the real joy of a dog's walk is to feel that you are getting farther and farther away from home, and that there are miles of heather and pine wood behind you, and yet you are still going on and on, with chances of more hares and more squirrels to run after. Sometimes the bishop would stop at a shepherd's hut or a lonely cottage under the lee of a hill, and sometimes he would sit down to examine a flower he had gathered in the wood. But they forgave him very good-temperedly, and could always find something to interest them while they waited. Ree generally sat down beside his master and stretched out his great limbs on the heather, for he liked to think he was taking care of somebody or something. Sperag would lie down for a minute, panting, with his little red tongue hanging out, and his hairy little paws all wet and muddy, but he never rested for long, but would dart off, pretending to have found a rat or a squirrel, even if none really existed. It was in December 1887. The weather was raw and cold. There was ice floating about on the loch, and the seagulls used to come up to the garden terrace to be fed. The young masters were away, and mistress could only take walks along the road. There was nothing to tempt her to a mountain scramble or a saunter in the woods. The bishop was very busy, and day after day the dogs would start up from the rug at the sound of the opening of his study door upstairs, and after a minute's anxious listening, with ears cocked and heads erect, they would lie down again with a sigh of disappointment, for there was no sound of approach to the hat stand, nor a whistled invitation for a walk. Finally came a sad day when the bishop went away, and dog life threatened to become monotonous. Then, one Saturday, hope revived, for a visitor came to the house, an old friend whom they loved and trusted as a good dog always loves what is trustworthy. He was a frequent visitor, and had in fact left the house but 3 weeks before. He was there for a holiday rest, and had leisure to bestow on dogs and on long walks, which they always shared. He was very thoughtful for them, not the sort of a man who would set off on a whole afternoon's ramble and say, when half a mile on his way, "I wish I'd remembered Ree and Sperag." He always remembered them and thought for them, and when he fed them after dinner, would always give big bits of biscuit to the big dog and little bits to the little dog, and it is not every one who has the sense for that. Every day, and often twice a day, he took them out, down to the church or the pier, or across the lake and up to the pass of Glencoe, where stern grey hills and hovering eagles and the deep silent valley still seemed to whisper together of a sad true story that happened there in just such weather as this 200 years ago. These were very happy days for dogs, for they did not mind the cold. It was only an excuse for wild scampering and racing, and they were very grateful for their friend's return. He had been ill, but was able to enjoy his walks, and though about 60 years of age, he had all those qualities of youth which endear a man to a dog or a child. He was brave and unselfish, and strong to love and to endure, and they loved him without knowing why, without knowing that he had lost his health from overwork in the service of the poor and suffering, and among the outcasts so low as to be beyond the sympathy of any heart less loving than that of a dog or of a very good man. Father Mulcahy he was always called, and though he had never had wife or children of his own, many a fatherless child and many a lonely grown-up man or a woman felt that it was quite easy and natural to call him by a name so sacred. On the Wednesday after he came, he took Ree and Sperag for a glorious walk through the shrubberies and out through a gate onto the road at the foot of the hill behind, a road that winds on and on for many miles, the mountains rising steeply above, the lake being cold and grey below, the bank that slopes away from the road to the water, in places covered with gorse and low bushes and heather, where an enterprising dog may hunt for rats and rabbits, or rush headlong after a peewit or a moorfowl as it rises with a scream at his approach and flutters off high into the air, and then descending to within a few feet of him, skims low before him, hopelessly far, yet tantalizingly near. The way was familiar to them, by land or by water. Often had they sailed up the loch in the same direction, farther and farther into the heart of the mountains, the valley becoming more and more narrow, the shores of the lake nearer and nearer to each other, till had they gone far enough, they would have reached the Dog's Ferry, a spot where the water is so narrow that a dog may easily swim across. Ree, strong swimmer that he was, had often crossed the loch near his master's house, where the ferry boats ply, and needed no dog's ferry, but few dogs made such powerful strokes in the water as he. This day, however, they did not reach the dog's ferry. The afternoon was closing in. There were streaks of gold in the dull grey sky, and it was, the good father thought, time to return. "Never mind, little man," he said, as Sperag looked reproachfully at him with wistful brown eyes gleaming through overhanging silvery locks. "We'll do it tomorrow, only we must set off earlier." This was good news, and the little dog started home gaily, running as little dogs will, 10 miles at least to every one of the road, and tired enough when home was reached at last. Dinner was a welcome feast, and Ree and Sperag slept sound till it was time for evening service. They always attended chapel night and morning, and took their places at the foot of the steps, halfway, when both were present, between mistress in her seat and master at the place of his sacred office. Tonight, as usual, they remained perfectly quiet and apparently indifferent to what was going on till, at the words, "Lighten our darkness," bedtime came into immediate prospect, and they started into expectant attitudes, awaiting the final Amen. Part 2. The next morning, though cold, was fine and fairly bright, and the dogs watched eagerly for signs of the promised walk. The service in chapel was rather long this morning, for as it was Advent, the Benedicite was read, and though Ree and Sperag noticed only that they had time for a longer nap than usual, there were some present who will never forget, as the season comes round again each year, the special significance of part of that song of praise. O ye frost and cold, O ye ice and snow, O ye nights and days, O ye light and darkness, O ye mountains and hills, O ye beasts and cattle, O ye holy and humble men of heart, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him for ever. But at last the service was over, and the dogs trotted out into the hall and followed mistress and their friend to the front door to see what the weather was like. It was not a specially pleasant morning, but it would do for a walk. and after waiting a few minutes to have some sandwiches cut, the only detention that could be endured with patience, the three set out. After about 6 miles they were on new ground, but on they went, the lake to the right of the road getting narrower, on past the Dog's Ferry and still on till the loch had become a river and could be crossed by a bridge. Ri and Sperag knew by a more certain method than looking at clocks that it was lunchtime, 1:30 at least, and they never thought of doubting that they would cross the bridge and turn homewards along the other side the loch, and so get in about tea time, or, for their friend was enterprising, by a longer way also on the farther side, either of which would involve a delightful long walk, but with just that hint of a homeward turn which even to dogs is acceptable when breakfast has become a mere memory. They accordingly followed the road onto the bridge, but as Father Maconochie did not overtake them, Ri, ever watchful of his friends, turned to look back and saw him speaking to a girl, after which, to their surprise, he whistled them back and instead of continuing along the road as it turned off to the right, kept straight on, though there was now only a rough track leading through a gate into the wood beyond. When they had advanced a few paces into the wood, he sat down under a tree and took out his packet of sandwiches. Ri and Sperag, sitting close beside him, had their share, or perhaps more, for their wistful brown eyes hungrily reminded him that they had multiplied the distance many times over, and that an unexpected luncheon out of doors is a joy in the dog's day of a kind for which a man may well sacrifice a part of his minor pleasure. Starting off again was a fresh delight. On they went, farther and farther, always climbing higher and getting deeper into the wood. To the left the steep mountainside rose abruptly above them. To the right below the path the river tore its way between steep banks down to its home in the lake. Now and then the trees parted and made way for a wild mountain torrent, leaping from rock to rock down the hillside, and rushing across their path to join the river below. As they climbed farther these became more frequent. Their friend could stride across, setting an occasional foot upon a stepping stone, and Ri, too, could cross safely enough, long-limbed as he was, though now and then he had to swim, and the streams were so rapid that it needed all his strength to cross the current. Sometimes he helped Sperag, for the brave little dog would always try to follow his big companion, and sometimes, with an anxious bark, would give warning that help was needed, and then the kind father would turn back to pick up the little dog and carry him till they were in safety. It was very hard work. They were always climbing, and in many places the road was polished with a thin coating of ice, but the dogs feared nothing and kept on bravely. The path dwindled to a mere track, and the climbing became steeper still. The streams crossed their road still oftener, and the stones were slippery with ice. The wood became thinner, and as they had less shelter from the trees, great flakes of half-frozen snow were driven against their faces. There was no thought now of hares or stags. Ri and Sperag had no energies left for anything but patient following. Poor little Sperag's long coat was very wet, and as it dried a little, it became hard and crisp with frost. The long hair falling over his eyes was matted together and tangled with briars, and his little feet were sore and heavy with mud that had caked in the long tassels of silky hair. Even Ri was very weary, and he followed soberly now instead of bounding along in front. His ears and tail drooped, and each time he crossed the ice-cold water he seemed more and more dejected. As they left the wood behind them, the snow fell thick and blinding, but just at first, as they came out into the open, it seemed not quite so dark as under the trees. There was nothing to be seen but grey sky and grey moor, Even the river had been left behind, and only blackened patches remained to show where, in summer, the ground was spread with a gay carpet of purple heather and sweet bog myrtle. They got deeper at each step into half-frozen marsh. There was no sound or sign of life. The dogs felt hungry and weary as they ached with the cold and wet, but they were following a friend, and they trusted him wholly. Well, they knew that each step was taking them farther from home and farther into the cold and darkness. But dog wisdom never asserts itself, and in trustful humility they followed still, and the snow came down closer and closer around them, and even the gray sky and the gray moor were blotted out, and the darkness fell. Part 3. It was a disappointing homecoming for the bishop that Thursday evening. There was no hearty handshake from waiting friend, no rejoicing bay of big dog, or extravagant excitement of little dog to welcome him. The three had been out the whole day, he was told, and had not yet reappeared. A long walk had been projected, but they had been expected home long before this. When dinner time came and they did not appear, 2 servants had been sent out with lanterns to meet them, as the road, though not one to be missed, was dark, and some small accident might have happened. The men were not back yet, but doubtless the missing party would soon return. The night was dark and stormy, and Father McConaughey had been for some time somewhat invalided, and as time passed, the bishop became increasingly anxious. At length he ordered a carriage, and with the gardener set off towards Kinloch, the head of the loch, thinking that accident or weariness might have detained his friend, and the carriage might be useful. On the way they met the first messengers returning with the news that nothing could be heard at Kinloch of the missing 3, except that they had passed there between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The bishop and his men sought along the road and inquired for tidings at the very few houses within reach, but in vain. The night was dark and little could be done, and there was always the hope that on their return they might find that some tidings had been heard, that the lost friends might have come back by the other side of the lake. So at last they turned back, reaching home about 4 o'clock in the morning. No news had been heard, and all felt anxious and perplexed, but most believed that some place of shelter had been reached, as the dogs had not come home. They could find their way home from anywhere, and there seemed little doubt that, overtaken by darkness, all 3 had found shelter in a shepherd's or gamekeeper's hut, perhaps on the other side of the lake, as they had almost certainly crossed the bridge, no one having met them on the road by which they had started. Nevertheless, all that was possible must be done in case of the worst, and as soon as daylight returned, 4 parties of men were dispatched in different directions, the bishop himself choosing that which his friend and the dogs were known to have taken the day before. A whole day of search over miles and miles of the desolate wintry mountains revealed but one fact, that the party had eaten their luncheon under a tree in the wood beyond the bridge. The squirrels had left the sandwich paper there to tell the tale, and for the first time it seemed likely that they had not turned homewards on reaching the head of the lake, either by the same road they had come, or by that on the other side of the water and through Glencoe. One by one the search parties came home with no tidings. No trace of the wanderers had been seen. No bark of dogs had been heard. No help had been found towards the discovery of the sad secret. Weary and heartsick, as all felt, no time was to be lost. Every hour made the anxiety greater, and all were ready in a very short time to start afresh. Again, for the second time, all through the long night they wandered over the mountains, through the wood, and across the deer forest beyond. It was an awful night. Again and again were their lights blown out. The snow lay deep in all the hollows. Where the streams had overflowed their banks, the path was a sheet of solid ice. The rocks, polished and slippery, were climbed with utmost difficulty. At every opening in the hills, an ice-cold wind whirled down glen and corrie. Sleet and hailstones beat against their faces. The frozen pools in the marshes gave way beneath their feet. The night was absolutely dark. Not a star shone out to give them courage. The silence and the sounds were alike awful. Sometimes they could hear each other's labored breathing as they tottered on the ice or waded through the snow. Sometimes all other sounds were lost in the shrieking of the whirlwinds, the crackling of the ice, and the roaring of the swollen, angry streams. What could have happened? Even if accident had occurred, either or both of the dogs would surely have returned. And how could even a Highland dog, hungry and shelterless, live through such a night as this? Morning came again, and returning to the point near the bridge at which the carriage had been left, two of the parties met and drove home for food and dry clothing, and to learn what others might have to tell. There was no news, and again the same earnest friends, with many more kind helpers, set out on their almost hopeless journey. The trackless wilds of the deer forest seemed the most likely field for search, and all now in various groups set off in this direction. Hour after hour passed without any gleam of hope, and even the bishop began to feel that everything possible had been done, and was turning sadly homewards. A second party, a few hundred yards behind, had almost come to the same resolve. Many of the men had been without rest since Thursday, and even the dog, who was one of the keepers of the deer forest, had joined the party, was limping wearily, and was exhausted by the cold and the rough walking. Suddenly he stopped, and with ears pricked and head erect listened. No one knows better than a Highlander the worth of a collie's opinion, and more than one stopped to listen too. Not far away, and yet faint, came the bark of a dog. Among the men was Sandy, one of the bishop's stablemen, who knew and loved Ree and Sperag, and his heart leapt as he recognized the deerhound's bay. Away to their left, the mountains were cleft by a narrow glen. The sound came from the bank on the hither side. The bishop and his party had climbed to the farther side, but a shout reached them, alert and watchful as they were. They turned back wondering, scarcely daring to hope. The man who had called them were hastening to a given point, the dog nose to ground, preceding them. There is no mistaking the air of a dog on business. The collie's intentness was as different from his late dejection as was the present haste of the men from the anxious watchful plodding of their long search. In another moment they came in sight of something which made them hold back the dog, and which arrested their own footsteps. The bishop himself must be the first to tread on what all felt was holy ground. There, on the desolate hillside, lay the body of Father Moconnachie, wreathed about with the spotless snow, a peaceful expression on his face. One on either side sat the dogs, watching still, as they had watched through the 2 long nights of storm and darkness. Even the approach of friends did not tempt them to forsake their duty. With hungry, weary faces they looked towards the group which first came near them, but not till their own master knelt down beside all that remained of his old friend did they yield up their trust and rise, numbed and stiff, from the posts they had taken up who knows how long before. To say a few words of prayer and thanksgiving was the bishop's first thought, his second to take from his pocket the sandwiches he carried, and to give all to Ree and Sperag. A bier was contrived of sticks from a rough fence that marked the boundary of the deer forest, and the body was lifted from the frozen ground on which it lay. The return to Kinloch, where the carriage waited, was very difficult, and the bearers had to change places very often. Slow as was their progress, it was as rapid as Ri could manage, numbed with cold and exhausted with hunger. The little dog was easily carried, and for once little Spirag was content to rest. No one will ever know what those faithful dogs felt and endured during those 2 days and nights of storm and loneliness. Those who sought them in the darkness of that second awful night must have passed very near the spot where they lay, sleeping perhaps, or deafened by the storm, or even possibly listening anxiously with beating hearts to the footsteps which came so near, and yet turned away, leaving them faithful to their post in the night. They, in their degree, like the man whose last sleep they guarded, were true and faithful servants. It is pleasant to know that Ri and Spirag did not suffer permanently for all they had undergone. They lived for 5 years and a half after, and had many and many a happy ramble, when the sun was bright, and the woods were green, and squirrels and hares were merry. They could not be better cared for than they had always been, but if possible, they were more indulged. If they contrived to get a dinner in the kitchen as well as in the dining room, their friends remembered the days when they had none, and nobody told tales. If they lay in the sun quite across the front door, or took up the whole of the rug before the winter fire, everyone felt that there were arrears of warmth to be made up to them. Their portraits were painted, and in the sculpture, which in his own church commemorates Father Maconachie's death, the dogs have not been forgotten. Ri was the elder of the two, and towards the end of his 13 years showed signs of old age and became rheumatic and feeble. But Spirag, though 3 years younger, did not long survive him. They rest now under a cairn in the beautiful garden they loved so well. Dark green fir trees shelter their grave. A gentle stream goes merrily by on its way to the lake below, and in the crannies of the stones of which the cairn is built, foxgloves and primroses and little ferns grow fresh and green. On the cairn is this inscription: in memory of 15th December 1887. Ri died 19th January 1893. Spirag died 28th August 1893. End of section 21. Recording by Tanya K.
Section 22 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunil Goswami. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Monkey Tricks and Sally at the Zoo. Naturalist's Notebook. Some monkeys are cleverer and more civilized than others, and the chiefs have their followers well in hand. Every monkey having his own special duties, which he is very careful to fulfill. When the stores of food which have been collected are getting low, the elders of the tribe, greybeards with long manes, meet together and decide where they shall go to lay in fresh supplies. This important point being settled, the whole body of monkeys, even down to the very little ones, leave the woods or mountain ravine where they live and form into regular order. First scouts are posted, some being sent on to places in advance, others being left to guard the rear, while the main body, made up of the young and helpless monkeys, follow the chiefs, who march solemnly in front and carefully survey every precipice or doubtful place before they suffer anyone to pass over it. It is not at all easy, even for an elderly and experienced monkey, to keep order among the host of lively chattering creatures for whose safety he is responsible, and indeed it would often be an impossible task if it were not for the help of the rear guard. These much tried animals have to make up quarrels which often break out by the way, to prevent the greedy ones from stopping to eat every scrap of fruit or berry that hangs from the trees as they pass, and to scold the mothers who try to linger behind in order to dress their children's hair and to make them smart for the day. Under these conditions, it takes a long time even for monkeys to reach their destination, which is generally a cornfield. But once there, scouts are sent out to every rock or rising ground so as to guard against any surprise. Then the whole tribe fall to, and after filling their cheek pouches with ears of corn, they make up bundles to tuck under their arms. After the long march and the hasty picking, they begin to get thirsty as well as hungry, and the next thing is to find some water. This is very soon done, as they seem able to detect it under the sand, however deep down it may be, and by dint of taking regular turns at digging, it does not take long before they have laid bare a well that is large enough for everybody. Monkeys love by nature to imitate what they see, and have been known to smoke a pipe and to pretend to read a book that they have seen other people reading. But sometimes they can do a great deal more than this and show that they can calculate and reason better than many men. A large Abyssinian monkey was one day being taken round Khartoum by its master and made to perform all sorts of tricks for the amusement of the bystanders. Among these was a date seller who was squatting on the ground beside his fruit. Now the monkey was passionately fond of dates, but being very cunning was careful not to let this appear, and went on performing his tricks as usual, drawing little by little nearer to the date basket as he did so. When he thought he was near enough for his purpose, he first pretended to die slowly and naturally, and then, after lying for a moment on the sand as stiff as a corpse, suddenly bounded up with a scream straight in front of the date seller's face and stared at him with his wild eyes. The man looked back at him spellbound, quite unaware that one of the monkey's hind feet was in the date basket, plowing up as much fruit as its long toes could hold. By some such trick as this, the monkey managed to steal enough food daily to keep him fat and comfortable. No cleverer monkey ever lived than the ugly old Sally, who died at the Zoological Gardens of London only a few years ago. Her keeper had spent an immense deal of time and patience in training her up, and it was astonishing what she was able to do. "Sally," he would say, putting a tin cup full of milk into her hands with a spoon hanging from it, "show us how you used to drink when you were in the woods." Upon which Sally stuck all her fingers into the milk and sucked them greedily. "Now," he continued, "show us how you drink since you became a lady." And then Sally took the spoon and drank her milk in dainty little sips. Next he picked up a handful of straw from the bottom of the cage and remarked carelessly, "Here, just tear those into six, will you? All the same length." Sally took the straws, and in half a minute the thing was done. But she had not come to the end of her surprises yet. "You are very fond of pear, I know," said the keeper, producing one out of his pocket and cutting it with his knife. "Well, I'm going to put some on my hand, but you are not to touch it until I have cut 2 short pieces and 3 long ones, and then you may take the second long one, but you aren't to touch any of the rest." The man went on cutting his slices without stopping, and was quite ready to begin upon a 6th when Sally stretched out her hand and took the 4th lying along the row which she had been told she might have. Very likely she might have accomplished even more wonderful things than this, but one cold day she caught a chill and died in a few hours of bronchitis. End of section 22. Recording by Sunil Goswami.
Section 23 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. How the Cayman was killed. From Waterton's Wanderings in South America. In the year 1782, there was born in the old house of Walton, near Pontefract, in Yorkshire, a boy named Charles Waterton, who afterwards became very famous as a traveler and a naturalist. As soon as he could walk, he was always to be found poking about among trees or playing with animals, and both at home and at school he got into many a scrape through his love of adventure. He was only about 10 when some other boys dared him to ride on a cow, and of course he was not going to be beaten. So up he got, while the cow was only thinking about how good the grass tasted. But the moment she felt a strange weight on her back, she flung her heels straight into the air, and off flew Master Waterton over her head. Many years after this, Waterton was traveling in South America, seeing and doing many curious things. For a long time he had set his heart on catching a caiman, a kind of alligator that is found in the rivers of Guyana. For this purpose he took some Indians with him to the Essequibo, which falls into the sea not far from Demerara, and was known to be a famous place for caimans. It was no good attempting to go after them during the long bright day. They were safely in hiding, and never thought of coming out till the sun was below the horizon. So Waterton and his Indians waited in patience till the moon rose, and everything was still, except that now and then a huge fish would leap into the air and plunge again under water. Suddenly there broke forth a fearful noise, unlike the cry of any other creature. As one came and called, another answered, and although caimans are not very common anywhere, that night you would have thought that the world was full of them. The three men stopped eating their supper of turtle and turned and looked over the river. Waterton could see nothing, but the Indian silently pointed to a black log that lay in the stream, just over the place where they had baited a hook with a large fish and bound it on a board. At the end of the board a rope was fastened, and this was also made fast to a tree on the bank. By and by the black log began to move, and in the bright moonlight he was clearly seen to open his long jaws and to take the bait inside them. But the watchers on shore pulled the rope too soon, and the caiman dropped the bait at once. Then for an hour he lay quite still, thinking what he should do next, but feeling cross at having lost his supper, he made up his mind to try once more, and cautiously took the bait in his mouth. Again the rope was pulled, and again the bait was dropped into the river. But in the end the caiman proved more cunning than the Indians, for after he played this trick for 3 or 4 times, he managed to get the fish without the hook. And when the sun rose again, Waterton knew that caiman hunting was over for that day. For 2 or 3 nights they watched and waited, but did not ever get so near success as before. Let them conceal the hook and the bait ever so cleverly, the caiman was sure to be cleverer than they, and when morning came, the bait was always gone and the hook always left. The Indians, however, had no intention of allowing the caiman to beat them in the long run, and one of them invented a new hook, which this time was destined to better luck. He took 4 or 5 pieces of wood about a foot long, barbed them at each end, and tied them firmly to the end of a rope 30 yards long. Above the barb was baited the flesh of an acuri, a creature the size of a rabbit. The whole was then fastened to a post driven into the sand, and the attention of the caiman aroused to what was going on by some sharp blows on an empty tortoise-shell, which served as a drum. About 5:30 the Indian got up and stole out to look, and then he called triumphantly to the rest to come up at once, for on the hook was a caiman, 10 feet and a half long. But hard as it had been to secure him, it was nothing to the difficulty of getting him out alive and with his scales uninjured, especially as the 4 Indians absolutely refused to help, and that left only 2 white men and a Negro to grapple with the huge monster. Of these 2, the Negro showed himself very timid, and it was not easy to persuade him to be of any use. The position was certainly puzzling. If the Indians refused to help, the caiman could not be taken alive at all, and if they gave it, it was only at the price of injuring the animal and spoiling its skin. At length a compromise occurred to Waterton. He would take the mast of the canoe, which was about 8 feet long, and would thrust it down the caiman's throat if it showed any signs of attacking him. On this condition the Indians agreed to give their aid. Matters being thus arranged, Waterton then placed his men, about 7 in all, at the end of the rope and told them to pull till the caiman rose to the surface, while he himself knelt down with a pole about 4 yards from the bank, ready for the caiman, should he appear, roaring. Then he gave the signal, and slowly the men began to pull. But the caiman was not to be caught without a struggle. He snorted and plunged violently till the rope was slackened, when he instantly dived below. Then the men braced all their strength for another effort, and this time out he came and made straight for Waterton. The naturalist was so excited by his capture that he lost all sense of the danger of his position. He waited till the caiman was within a few feet of him, when he flung away his pole and with a flying leap landed on the caiman's back, twisting up the creature's feet and holding tightly on to them. The caiman, very naturally, could not in the least understand what had happened, but he began to plunge and struggle, and to lash out behind with his thick, scaly tail, while the Indians looked on from afar, and shouted in triumph. To Waterton, the only fear was lest the rope proved too weak for the strain, in which case he and the caiman would promptly disappear into the depths of the Essequibo. But happily the rope was strong, and after being dragged by the Indians for 40 yards along the sand, the caiman gave in, and Waterton contrived to tie his jaws together and to lash his feet onto his back. Then he was put to death, and so ended the chase of the caiman. End of section 23.
Section 24 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marilyn Rakes. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 24, The Story of Fido, by Miss A. M. Aline. Fido's master had to go a long journey across the country to a certain town, and he was carrying with him a large bag of gold to deposit at the bank there. This bag he carried on his saddle, for he was riding, as in those days there were no trains, and he had to travel as quickly as he could. Fido scampered cheerfully along at the horse's heels, and every now and then the man would call out to her, and Fido would wag her tail and bark back an answer. The sun was hot, and the road dusty, and poor Fido's little legs grew more and more tired. At last they came to a cool, shady wood, and the master stopped, dismounted, and tied his horse to a tree, and took his heavy saddlebags from the saddle. He laid them down very carefully, and pointing to them, said to Fido, "Watch them." Then he drew his cloak about him, lay down with his head on the bags, and soon was fast asleep. Little Fido curled herself up close to her master's head, with her nose over one end of the bags, and went to sleep too. But she did not sleep very soundly, for her master had told her to watch, and every few moments she would open her eyes and prick up her ears in case anyone were coming. The Wounding of Fido. Her master was tired and slept soundly and long, much longer than he had intended. At last he was awakened by Fido's licking his face. The dog saw that the sun was nearly setting, and knew that it was time for her master to go on his journey. The man patted Fido and then jumped up, much troubled to find he had slept so long. He snatched up his cloak, threw it over his horse, untied the bridle, sprang into the saddle, and calling Fido, started off in great haste. But Fido did not seem ready to follow him. She ran after the horse and bit at his heels, and then ran back again to the woods, all the time barking furiously. This she did several times. But her master had no time to heed her, and galloped away, thinking she would follow him. At last the little dog sat down by the roadside and looked sorrowfully after her master, until he had turned a bend in the road. When he was no longer in sight, she sprang up with a wild bark and ran after him again. She overtook him just as he had stopped to water his horse at a brook that flowed across the road. She stood beside the brook and barked so savagely that her master rode back and called her to him. But instead of coming, she darted off down the road, still barking. Her master did not know what to think, and began to fear that his dog was going mad. Mad dogs are afraid of water, and act in a strange way when they see it. While the man was thinking of this, Fido came running back again and dashed at him furiously. She leapt at the legs of his horse, and even jumped up and bit the toe of her master's boot. Then she ran down the road again, barking with all her might. Her master was now sure that she was mad, and, taking out his pistol, he shot her. He rode away quickly, for he loved her dearly, and could not bear to see her die. He had not ridden very far when he stopped suddenly, He felt under his coat for his saddlebags. They were not there. Could he have dropped them, or had he left them behind in the wood where he had rested? He felt sure they must be in the wood, for he could not remember having picked them up or fastening them to his saddle. He turned his horse and rode back again as hard as he could. When he came to the brook, he sighed and said, "Poor Fido." But though he looked about, he could see nothing of her. When he crossed the brook, he saw some drops of blood on the ground, and all along the road he still saw drops of blood. Tears came into his eyes, and he felt very sad and guilty, for now he understood why little Fido had acted so strangely. She knew that her master had left behind his precious bags of gold, and so she had tried to tell him in the only way she could. All the way to the wood lay the drops of blood. At last he reached the wood, and there, all safe, lay the bags of gold. And beside them, with her little nose lying over one end of them, lay faithful Fido, who, you will be pleased to hear, recovered from her wound and lived to a great age. End of chapter 24.
Section 25 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunil Goswami. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Beasts Besieged. Adapted from Théophile Gautier. 25 years ago, in the winter of 1870-1871, Paris was closely besieged by the Germans, who had beaten one French army after another on the frontier and had now advanced into the very heart of the country. The cold was frightful and no wood could be got, and as if this was not enough, food began to give out, and the people inside the city soon learned to know the tortures of hunger. There was no hay or corn for the horses. After sheep and oxen, they were the first animals to be eaten. And then whispers were heard about elephants and camels and other beasts in the Jardin des Plantes, which is the French name for the zoological gardens. Now it is quite bad enough to be taken from the forests and deserts where you never did anything but just what you chose, and to be shut up in a small cage behind bars. But it is still worse not to have enough food to eat, and worst of all, to be made into food for other people. Luckily, the animals did not know what was being talked about in the world outside, or they would have been more uncomfortable than they were already. Any visitor to the Jardin des Plantes about Christmas time in 1870 and for many weeks later would have seen a strange sight. Some parts of the gardens were set aside for hospitals, and rows of beds occupied every sheltered building. Passing through these, the visitor found himself in the kingdom of the beasts, who were often much more gentle than their jailers. After coming from the streets where nothing was the same as it had been 6 months before and everything was topsy-turvy, it was almost soothing to watch the animals going on in their usual way, quite regardless of what men might be doing outside. There was the white bear swinging himself from side to side and rubbing his nose against the bars, just as he had done on the day that he had first taken up his abode here. There was a camel still asking for cakes, and an elephant trumpeting with fury because it didn't get any. Nobody had cakes for themselves, and it would have been far easier to place a gold piece in the twirling proboscis. An elephant who is badly fed is not a pretty spectacle. Its skin is so large that it seems as if it would take in at least 3 or 4 extra bodies, and having only one shrunken skeleton to cover, it shrivels up into huge wrinkles and looks like the earth after a dry summer. On the whole, certain kinds of bears come off best, for they can sleep all the winter through, and when they wake up, the world will seem the same as when they last shut their eyes. And unless their friend the white bear tells them in bear language all that has happened, they will never be any the wiser. Still, it is not all the bears who are lucky enough to have the gift of sleep. Some remained broad awake and stood idly about in the corners of their dens, not knowing how to get rid of the time that hung so heavily on their paws. What was the use for the big brown marten to go up to the top of his tree when there was no one to tickle his nose with a piece of bread at the end of a string? Why should his brother take the trouble to stand up on his hind legs when there was nobody to laugh and clap him? Only one very young bear indeed, with bright eyes and yellow skin, went on his own way regardless of spectators, and he was busily engaged in looking at himself in a pail of water and putting on all sorts of little airs and graces from sheer admiration of his own beauty. Perhaps the most to be pitied of all were the lions, for they do not know how to play, and could only lie about and remember the days when towards sunset they crept towards the cool hill and waited till the antelopes came down for their evening drink, and then, then. But that is only a memory. While stretched out close by is the poor lioness in the last stage of consumption, and looking more like those half-starved fighting lions you see on royal coats of arms than a real beast. At such times, most children would give anything to catch up the zoological gardens and carry them right away into the center of Africa and let out the beasts and make them happy and comfortable once more. But that was not the feeling of the little boy who had been taken by his mother to see the beasts as a treat for his birthday. At each cage they passed he came to a standstill, and gazing at the animal with greedy eyes, he said, "Mother, would you like to eat that?" Every time his mother answered him, "No one eats these beasts, my boy. They are brought from countries a long way off and cost a great deal of money." The child was silent for a moment, but at the sight of the zebra, the elk, or the little hyena, his face brightened again, and his voice might be heard peeping forth its old question, "Mother, would you like to eat that?" It's a comfort to think that the horrid, greedy boy was disappointed in his hopes. Whatever else he may have eaten, the taste of lions and of bears is still strange to him, for the siege of Paris came to an end at last, and the animals were made happy as of old with their daily portions. End of section 25. Recording by Sunil Goswami.
Section 26 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susie White. Mr. Gully by Miss Elspeth Campbell. He was a herring gull, and one of the largest I have ever seen. He was beautiful to look at with his soft gray plumage, never a feather of which was out of place. Of his character I will say nothing. That can be best judged by reading the following truthful biography of my Dove of the Waters. I cannot begin at the beginning. Of his youth, which doubtless in every sense of the word was a stormy one, I know nothing. He had already acquired the wisdom, or perhaps in his case slyness is a better word, of years by the time that he came to us. Gully was found one day in a field near our house in a very much exhausted condition. He had probably come a long distance, which he must have accomplished on foot, as he was unable to fly owing to his wing having been pinioned. He was very hungry, and greedily bolted a small fish that we offered him, and screamed for more. We then turned him into the garden, where he soon found a sheltered corner by our dining room window, and went to sleep standing on one leg. The other one he always kept tucked away, so that was quite invisible. Next morning I came out to look for Gully and feed him. He had vanished. I thought of the pond where I kept my goldfish, 40 beautiful goldfish. There, sure enough, was Mr. Gully swimming about contentedly. But where were the goldfish? Instead of the crystal clear pond was a pool of muddy water. Instead of 40 goldfish, all that I could make out, when Mr. Gully had been chased away and the water given time to settle, was one miserable little half-dead fish, the only survivor of the 40. This was the first of Gully's misdeeds. To look at Gully, no one could believe him to be capable of hurting a fly. He had the most lovely, gentle brown eyes you ever saw, and seemed more like a benevolent old professor than anything else. He generally appeared to be half asleep, or else sunning himself with a contented smile on his thoughtful countenance. Gully next took to killing the sparrows. He was very clever at this. When he had finished eating, the sparrows were in the habit of appropriating the remnants of the feast. This Gully strongly disapproved of. So when he had eaten as much as he wanted, he retired behind a chair and waited till the sparrows were busy feasting. Then he would make a rush and seize the nearest offender. He sometimes used to kill as many as from 2 to 4 sparrows a day in this manner. The pigeons then took to coming too near his reach. At first he was afraid of them and left them alone. But the day came when a young fantail was foolish enough to take his airing on the terrace, close to Mr. Gully's nose. This was too much for Mr. Gully, who pounced upon the unfortunate squeaker and slew him. La petite vie de Méjean. And after this, Mr. Gully took the greatest delight in hunting these unfortunate birds and murdering them. No pigeon was too large for him to attack. I only just succeeded in saving the cock powder, a giant among pigeons, from an untimely death by coming up in time to drive Mr. Gully away from his victim. After this, we decided to shut Mr. Gully up. We thought he would make a charming companion for the guinea pigs. At that time, I used to keep about 50 of various species in a hen run. So to the guinea pigs, Gully was banished. At first, the arrangement answered admirably. Gully behaved as nicely as possible for about a month, and we were all congratulating ourselves on having found such a good way out of our difficulty, when all at once his thirst for blood was roused afresh. One day he murdered 4 guinea pigs, and the next day 3 more of these unfortunate little beasts. We then let him join the hens and ducks. He at once constituted himself the leader of the latter. Every morning he would lead them down to a pond at the bottom of the fields, a distance of about 1/4 of a mile, and every evening he would summon them round him and lead them home. At his cry, the ducks and drakes would come waddling up to him with loud quacks. He used always to march in the most stately manner about 2 yards ahead of them. Of the cocks and hens, Gully deigned to take no notice. On 2 occasions he made an exception to this rule of conduct. On the first, he and a hen had a dispute over the possession of a worm. This dispute led to a fight, of which Gully was getting the best, when the combatants were separated. On the second occasion, Gully was accused of decapitating a hen. No one saw him do it, but it looked only too like his work. He had a neat, clean style. One day he led his ducks to the pond as usual, but in the evening they returned by themselves. We came to the conclusion that the poor old bird must be dead. We quite gave him up for lost and had mourned him for 2 or 3 weeks, when what should we see one day but Mr. Gully leading his ducks as usual to his favorite pond, as if he had never been away. Where he had spent all the time he was absent remains a mystery to this day. After this he remained with us some time, during which he performed no new feat of valor with the exception of one fight which he had with a cat. In this fight he had some feathers pulled out, but ultimately succeeded in driving her off after giving her legs such a bite that she was lame for many a long day. Since then he has again disappeared. Will he ever return? Mysterious was his coming, and mysterious his going. End of section 26.